Welcome to the June Loki community call. I'm having a real hard time not telling people to smash that like button. So do it. Subscribe. I didn't upload last month's YouTube video yet, so that's less funny unless you were here last month. But a few things on the agenda. If anyone wants anything to talk about or to talk about anything, just add it to the list. And otherwise, unfortunately, we're missing Danny and Cyril, who did the bulk of the work on two of the things we want to talk about, but we'll do our best to represent their efforts. So Owen is going to start by talking about some recording rules.
Yeah, I'm going to do what I do best. That is take credit for other people's work. Yeah, so Danny authored a PR recently that has been in the works for a while that introduces recording rules into Loki. Now, for users of Prometheus, this might sound pretty familiar and was largely enabled by the new experimental remote write API support in Prometheus itself, but also works with things like Cortex and Thanos. And the idea here is that you can use the ruler component that's already responsible for evaluating alerting rules in Loki, but you can also introduce recording rules, and those would be log metric queries, so extracting metrics from logs that you then want to remote write into the Prometheus compatible backend, effectively creating metrics out of logs and then storing them in a native metric store. So you can do this for a bunch of reasons, right? Probably most commonly for pre-processing queries that may be particularly expensive, right? Being able to calculate these continuously at, like every 1 minute, aggregate, some expensive query across all these logs, right? Turn it into a set of series in Prometheus and then write those to a Prometheus compatible backend. And then you can use those just within Prometheus from there. So that's kind of like one of the aspects, and then you can get progressively more complex from there for a few kind of other more advanced use cases I'm probably not going to go into on this call. But hopefully we'll be adding some documentation around that soon, and would love to get people using it. It's largely built on top of the existing ruler component, and a lot of the internal work was already there, which is really handy, so we feel pretty confident in pushing this forward. And
yeah. I'm actually just going to solicit a little feedback if anybody has any. So this has come up in our conversations. We don't really have any limits that we apply in Loki right now around recording rules or alerting rules. So there's sort of two types of limits that come to mind. One would be the duration that the query can run for, right? So I'm going to feel a little stupid here. I'm trying to think of what the syntax looks like for that, but it would be the for clause for the alerting rule, right? But there's not one of those for a recording rule, is there?
No, there's not a for clause for recording rules because they are just evaluated to create metrics. For clause and alerting rules would be, alert me if I see a high rate of errors in my logs for 10 minutes, or for 5 minutes. And a recording rule will just generate a metric constantly.
So the question would be, if someone says, alert me if I see this in my logs for 30 days, you can do that now, and it's definitely going to break something. So, do we want a limit for that? I think the answer is probably yes.
I think that will actually technically be okay as long as you don't roll pods there, although it's a little bit more complex. For those pretty familiar with LogQL, if you want to do like a 30-day rate, for instance, right? And that'd be the bracket syntax. That would...
Well, that's the second one, yeah. So that's the one I'm more probably concerned about.
But that one is definitely something that we're probably going to look at adding. But the overarching, I think, sentiment here is that, right, like if you were a bad actor, there's a couple ways which you could kind of mess things up. we'll, probably do our best to close holes on.
Yeah. So the for duration has the problem of it. Instant queries are only evaluated on one query. We're not going to parallel, or that's currently not parallelized. So you're going to be running a 30-day query every so often or something like that. So that one I think is pretty straightforward to limit. It's pretty easy to sort of understand the intent of an alerting rule and work around it. This other one I think is more interesting because someone had a really good use case and an issue that I was looking at yesterday where I would say, so like within like the Prometheus world, we do limits on the range part. So the, inside the square brackets. Somebody wrote a recording rule or an alerting rule that was looking for a count of basically the word login succeeded or something like that over a 6-hour period, and the lack of that would trigger an alert. So it's kind of an interesting idea of like, hey, nobody's logged into my service in 6 hours. That means probably something is broken, right? Like, or something bad has happened. That'd be an uncommon case. So I was thinking we would want to limit that for the reasons like recording rule and alerting rule type queries aren't really intended to be intensive because they run frequently. And so I don't have a great answer here, although we probably will add limits. It's just a question of like, what do they default to then? Is the but yeah, the downside, right, is you end up with recording or with rulers that will probably crash on you if they have sufficient numbers of rules and you're running a lot of really large range queries. This stuff is currently unlimited, but we probably will be adding limits, I guess, is the way there.
Yeah, totally agree. For what it's worth, right, these are all the same problems that kind of exist in, or that you have to be wary about with recording rules in general, be it in Prometheus or be it in something like Cortex or Thanos as well. We do have a couple limits that are more administrative, and so you can basically specify like a group of rules to be evaluated together. And so there are things like the max number of those that could be within a group, or I believe what do we have total, which is max groups per tenant, and all these are per tenant overrides. And basically you can specify like where your Prometheus backend is, and it'll consume the remote write API and just write them upstream for you. Probably don't want to get too much farther in the weeds unless
I feel like
specific question
there would be more of a discussion around that than maybe there really is. So.
I think
pointing out the challenges is maybe what the point of that was.
Yeah, I think that we should probably add a little bit of documentation both around why you would want this, right? What does it enable you to do? Why is it attractive? What do we use it for? As well as excuse me.
A great segue, Owen. Documentation.
Yeah. Is that next up?
Yeah, Diana, you put this on here. Do you want to introduce Karen?
Sure. She'll have to come out of hiding for a moment, but Loki has a brand new technical writer devoted entirely to Loki OSS. So she's still getting up to speed, but she will be figuring out what the documentation needs to be better, and part of that is looking at stuff because she's a very experienced writer. Some of it is talking to people, and some of it's listening to the community. Anyway, Karen, feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, if you want to.
If it helps any of y'all, born and raised hardware design engineer. Switched to software early on. Done lots of technical writing as well as computer science teaching in my past. I'm now with Grafana Labs and came from VMware, which was derived from Pivotal software. That's my background, if it helps you. I put in my first review of a Loki docs PR yesterday or the day before, something that's pull request that Cyril put in, and we're going back and forth now on it. Hope to hear all your suggestions for things that you want me to work on, especially your priorities. What do you think ought to happen first? So, thanks.
Yeah, that's great, Karen. Actually, while you were talking, I sort of put in there a loose order of, I called focus, maybe it's priorities of what we want to do. And to me, that currently would say like just the general organization, like a review. Like we basically took one major pass at the docs probably a year and a half ago. Robert Frotto did, and we got through quite a bit of it. But one challenge with open source projects, which is great and tough, but we get a lot of contributions to the docs, but it's also means that over time, I feel like the voice becomes a little less consistent as more and more people add things here and there. And I think we've lost some of our organization, so we kind of want to iterate over that again and try to keep it as consistent as we can with other Grafana projects like Grafana and Tempo. And then the other areas that I know that we're lacking examples and how-tos, so make the project a little more accessible to people that aren't familiar at all with Loki or Cortex or Prometheus. And then the maybe I'll put this in here too. I keep calling it the day 2 operations. So things like schema or schema, I guess call it. I hate using schema because it's nuanced in this context. But so things like, store schemas, operating Loki over a longer period. I know one of the things we get asked about a lot that is probably not going to be in scope here is still things about like kind of resource sizing and scaling and but the like guides around operations, and only just because there's just sort of so many ways and places you can run Loki that I don't know. I'd ultimately like to crowdsource that initiative, like have us build a good benchmarking suite that people can use to provide that info. But yeah, so that's the what we want to do. Kind of, the goal would be to help people that are new, as well as like the secondary stuff. Like, so I think our reference docs are okay. It's just hard to find things. Like a lot of the actions that, like here's a good one, right? Like what permissions do I need on my S3 bucket? Like that's in our docs, but you'd be hard pressed to find it, I think. So we're going to work on that. Questions or comments, feedback on docs?
I'm glad we this has been something we've talked about for so long, and it's always been hard to prioritize, right? And this is like definitely on us in a lot of regards.
Yeah, well, thank the community for helping make the project popular and helping us get more resources to work on it.
And speaking of, hey community, if you have any thoughts you want to share on the docs, now is a great time.
Yeah, speak now or just
speak now or file an issue.
Yeah, that works too. All right, Zach, you want to talk about the Fluent Bit Unwrap question that I don't know if I can answer, but I'm interested.
Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody can. Yeah. So I'm doing the whole CloudWatch logs from ECS Fargate. You can see my dog with the donut of shame in the back. Yes. It's a donut, not a cone. So we're doing the FluentBit FireLens shipper from Fargate on ECS, and and I discovered kind of along the way that FluentBit's mode of operation is that whatever log you get it doesn't ship it as is. It has to like wrap it in kind of an envelope, and so you get this extraneous like log layer on top of your message, right? And so in key value format, it doesn't really look all that bad because it's just log equals and then a big set of quotes with the rest of your giant log message stream in there. If you use JSON format and your logs happen to be JSON, it double JSON encodes it.
Yeah.
Which is it's incredibly obnoxious. And then when I'm looking at stuff in Loki, I can, hey, I can hit the JSON filter and then unwrap it, but then you have to run it through a second one to get your fields out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was showing that to someone, and they were just like, I'm not going to remember to do that. And I said, that's fair. What I didn't know is if there's some way. The problem is the Fluent bit is going straight to Loki, and I don't know if there's some way to say like drop this crap at the top of the log, right? I thought maybe, hey, I could redirect it into Promtail, but then there's like now I have the Promtail ordering problem, I think.
What version are you using the native output of FluentBit?
Yeah, it's not the Loki FluentBit plugin, right? Yeah, I went to the native one. Specifically, I'm using the downstream AWS one because they include some extra utilities that do health checks and stuff on it.
I wonder where that wrapper is actually coming from, because I guess
it's from FluentBit itself. I finally found it like in their docs. It says that's how they ship logs. Yeah.
Can you throw a link in there? I'd love to take a look.
The only reason that surprises me is like tons of people use FluentBit, and I had not heard of anyone else having this problem.
Yeah. I mean, my guess would be any of the label-based cardinality problems would probably be coincidental there, because what's coming through that you're describing, and as I understand it, is the log line itself, right, which is independent from the labels.
Yeah. So it's the log line itself, right?
Yeah. So it seems like I'm sure. Is it Eduardo runs that, builds that? Ed maintains it.
FluentBit. Yeah, Eduardo's who we've worked with.
Yeah, we can probably.
I'm curious about this.
It sort of sucks because I thought maybe I could pull it out like, hey, if you provide a custom comp file to AWS, they'll run that whole thing, so you can do like a pipeline in it as well. But there's that log wrapper gets added on like as they ship it, so there's nothing I can do until it's at the recipient end. So yeah, like I said, I don't know if it was something like throw it on Promtail and have Promtail carve up the log, but again, then there's I think right now, until you guys have the next release, I think there's at least the time ordering problem.
Yeah, that's probably going to be what 2 releases. So it's mostly designed, but I haven't started working on it yet.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll have to poke into that a little bit. I'm just interested in what if you can paste the link to the docs you found.
Yeah, I'll try to find that again. I think it wasn't specifically in their log. I think I finally found somebody else asking, and it was like a Fluent employee responded saying like, "Oh yeah, that's how it ships."
Huh.
Yeah, I think the only thing at the moment is using the line format function at the end of basically every query, right, to only select that field. Right, so if it's JSON, pipe JSON, pipe line format, dot log,
it's just
whatever.
That's what I was doing when it was outputting JSON, because it was so difficult to read. It worked for me, but like I said, like most of my dev team are just not going to remember to do any of that.
Yeah, that's pretty reasonable.
Alrighty, thanks, Zach. So I want to just briefly mention, which unfortunately Cyril's not here to talk about it. I was putting another PR in here. Loki has custom retention now. Well, kind of. It's merged into main. There's no release with it yet, but so this brings the ability to, through config, define stream selectors to set the the retention for different log streams to different time periods. So I'll give everyone a quick recap of how retention works today, which is that Loki basically, with the exception of the file store, leaves that as an exercise to the storage component. So the index is pruned by the table manager after some time period, and then the objects themselves need to be set with a TTL or some policy to remove them. So what will change here is now Loki will be responsible and capable of removing, both pruning the index and removing objects from the file store. So you won't need to configure a TTL or anything on the object store. In fact, you won't want to, I guess, to avoid having that, delete something that isn't officially deleted yet. But yep, so the compactor now has a component that will go through and basically at regular intervals mark objects, remove them from the index first, and then come through and delete them from the object store. And we've been testing that out and playing around with it and making sure that we can get, good enough performance out of it. And so far things have been working really well for us. So there's a documentation PR open that Karen just mentioned that we are working through. And we got to figure out what the communication looks like for how you transition to using this from your current config, etc. But in the near future, so I'll pivot to that in just a sec. The only thing I mentioned first is included with this is also support for deletes. So you can do a delete of a stream for a targeted time range. So you can provide stream selectors in a time range. And honestly, this is mostly implemented alongside of custom retention for compliance reasons, specifically, GDPR or any other kind of compliance reason. So if we start keeping things longer than 30 days, we're going to need a way to remove things on request. And that's really the intent of the delete support. As a result, it basically deletes up to 24 hours ago, or put another way, if you put in a delete request, that request is basically held for 24 hours and then the delete is made. That does give you the option to change your mind if you wish to not delete it. And I think what I'm interested here is somehow we got to figure out a way to get community feedback. Maybe there's an issue here in terms of is there enough sort of drive to further extend that delete to be up to the minute accurate, as a some of the work for that already existed. The complexity that comes along with having delete support up to the minute basically means, because of the caching layers in Loki, you need to both be able to invalidate caches at several levels as well as do query time filtering. So you have to basically pass that delete filter through all of the different levels. So this implementation is I would say the kind of the simplest, was the least effort, and is a good starting point, but we'd be interested in kind of understanding how important it would be to people to kind of further pipe that through the rest of the components to be able to have, deletes to within, I guess I'm basically interested in is there a real use case for that, right? Somebody uploads or scrapes a password or something like that. I mean, yes, you can go delete it, but does that really help you? You still got to change it. If you check in a password into GitHub, right? You can go remove it, but you probably should still change it. So I'm not sure, maybe there are other use cases that people have for deletes that make it, more compelling, I guess. So I would have to say an issue for.
I think from a high level, this is really attractive because it allows you to do compliancy things that Ed mentioned. And it'll also allow you to say, I care about my application logs up to about 2 weeks, but I need to have these audit logs available for 6 months, right? And to be able to kind of slice and dice both across your tenants and across the streams within the tenants, kind of different retention policies that can be relevant to your organization.
So, two things I wanted to. So one of these is actually going to pivot to the next two, I think. The 2.3 will be the next release that has this support in it, and I would say roughly we are thinking, I would say towards the end of June. It's a little bit up in the air, and trying to avoid what I normally do, which is say, we'll do it next week, and then a month goes by. So let's say probably targeting end of June. So early July, maybe kick your July off with a new Loki release. So that would be recording rules and custom retention is the major features, as well as some other fixes. So there is actually one particularly useful fix that we found. There was rather a memory leak in the queries. Yes. So in the queries, when we download, so when you run a query, we asynchronously download chunks in a separate thread to try to keep the processing pipeline fed with chunks. When a query is canceled, we discovered that the Go routine that was fetching those chunks was not canceled. And so over time, you end up with a number of Go routines that went and pulled a chunk out of your object store with nowhere to send it, accumulating over time until, in our case, you would eventually, probably crash your querier. It was, I guess, interesting in the effect that like it was relatively unnoticed until we had a very particular situation, like a workload that someone set up that more or less caused the queries to crash. I don't know, every 20 or 30 minutes instead of every 4 or 5 days or something like that. So it was, significant. So it may not be hugely impactful. Like I said, the normal occurrence of it was actually fairly slow, but it is going to mean you're sitting on memory that you might want back. The K50 release is probably the one that people would want for that, right, Owen?
Yeah. Okay.
Can you find a tag for that quickly, or
yeah.
I can look too? So the internal releases that we use, we do push those images. Like as we've talked about this before, we don't have a great mechanism for how we would like communicate and curate that, but we'll put a link to that image in here. So if anybody's overly concerned about this, you can run K50. I guess the caveat that comes with that is, off the top of my head, I don't know what the scope of differences is. We haven't created the like upgrade guide for 2.2 to K50, but there's no breaking changes that I know of. I'm just, advising a little caution there to maybe not jump right to prod with that.
Yeah, it looks like we hotfixed K50 with the custom retention. So it'd be
maybe we'll wait for
a
K51.
wonky looking one.
Okay. Masad, I see your question about log archiving for compliance reasons. So the one way I would say that you could deal with that in the near future is using custom retention. So tell Loki to have longer retention on certain log streams. There's one question here, right, that I think a lot of people come to. Typically what most people do today is, and we've talked about whether or not to support this in our agent for this reason, is they use FluentBit or FluentD, which can basically send a gzipped version of the logs directly to S3 or to a bucket. And so that's sort of a simple way to meet compliance requirements, but it doesn't really help you. It's not like you can easily query those logs. But, it checks that box, which is probably what most people need. If you had a reason to go dig the logs out there, it's not that hard. Loki, its storage format itself is already pretty well suited for long-term retention. We're storing the index and the chunks right alongside each other in an object store, and you could do that for years and years and years. So I would say that, take a look at the custom retention stuff to see if, that's what our intention is going to do, is to be able to offer longer retention periods for compliance reasons effectively. So, so that with being able to say delete streams that are, have certain criteria, you can keep those for, 30 days or whatever, but other things you can set to be much longer. Does that kind of help answer that question a little?
So if I understood correctly, there was a setting about how far back Loki is going to search when you put a term in without a date range. I just want to double check that my understanding of documentation is correct. And if we keep 10 years worth of logs in our bucket and someone put a term, it is not just going to start searching through 10 years worth of log for that term if there is no someone make a mistake with time range or something like that. That was my concern when I was thinking about we can leave the objects and the indices, and we change that look back. If I remember the
Yes.
property name, we can change that look back and say that you won't be looking back more than 30 days, let's say, into the indices. Is my understanding correct on that documentation?
Yes, it is. So
Okay.
and I'd have to look up the flag because it's. I think you're almost 100% right that it has look back in it, but
Max query look back. It's a per tenant config. Masood got it exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, you would need that to be as big as you wanted. So if you wanted to query the 10-year-old logs, that limit would have to be at 10 years, basically.
Okay.
However, you could set Loki's retention or have no retention and keep the query look back to say 30 days, and effectively that Loki instance would only ever go look back 30 days. It would just fail queries that tried to query farther back in time.
Okay.
So you can, like, changing that config just changes what Loki lets itself do. The only one you really want to watch in terms of durability is the actual retention flags, and make sure that nothing is being deleted on you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
I'll note for Karen that look back config is a very confusing option for people in the Slack channel. It's like every couple of weeks there's someone who gets bit by that.
Cool. I'll make note of that.
Like a top 5 Loki config gotchas, you know?
It's one of the, they're like, oh, I'm storing like 6 months of logs and I'm only getting like 2 days of it.
You know, we just ran into that I got to look to, that the thing that it's tough for, so query timeouts. Like Loki has 4 places you can configure timeouts. And now Grafana has a data source proxy timeout that I believe defaults to 30 seconds. And I don't remember if that was new, but we just recently changed it in our environment because we were seeing, so like timeouts are a nightmare. And then if you throw Nginx in the middle, it has proxy timeouts. If you throw the other in the middle, like, it's just.
Yeah. What a fun time. Yeah.
I intended on writing a blog post for this because I set up like this Kubernetes cluster in my house, and I have Nginx sending to like a traffic ingress or whatever, and it was like, you know, I don't know, it took me the better part of a day to figure out how to get queries to run for longer than 30 seconds. And in this case, Nginx, when you set up in upstream in the load balancer section of it, like, it defaults to having a 30-second timeout, but it has this really nice behavior where if the thing times out, it auto retries the next one in the pool for you silently. So I can see the query being resubmitted in Grafana, but I had no idea who, or by Loki rather, and I had no idea who was doing it. So I don't know. That's an Nginx thing, but timeouts are a nightmare. I don't think we're making that any easier with basically.
We have talked a little bit about
server read and write timeouts. There's the query engine timeout, and then there's the query timeout. So there's.
I think timeouts are kind of illustrative of a larger problem, which is coordination of certain configurations.
Yeah.
Right. So there's also things like Loki uses Grpc internally between components, and you can specify like the like how large these kind of requests and responses can be. Right, and you can set them to different things, right? Which is probably not what you want, right? And so there's like a lot of places where we could probably derive sensible configurations, right? From
this came up in one of our Slack channels too, related to like the drift between defaults and how we run our environments, and how do we go about changing things that have defaults one way that we sort of run another, because it's a little bit of a breaking change in some folks' consideration. It's like, so if some flag, always is defaults to false, but we set it to true in every environment, should we just change the default to true? Because, obviously, like, our environments and the way we run things, like it seems intuitive to have those be the defaults, but it isn't one size fits all, and especially if you're running single binary configs versus microservices, and also the sort of nature of someone doing an upgrade, and all of a sudden things are much different. And So I don't know. There's an interesting debate there. I tend to lean on the side of I think we should try to steer our defaults to match the way we use Loki, because that gives us the most. It makes it easier for us to answer questions typically, because like most people's operations are similar to ours, so the behaviors are similar. But I don't know if there's a right answer here. All right, Zach, you're up.
Yeah, I gotta find it. Yeah, this is I didn't realize we were down there at the bottom. Yeah, this sort of thought kind of popped in. I was just curious, are you guys maybe going to go that way? So the recording rules is very specific to the ruler and to calculating for alerts. But is there some thought of like being able to use that in a more generalized fashion of pre-computing, like what might be kind of a complex or expensive query to run client side? Especially if you've got a bunch of dashboards that are running these, or something that we want more translated into, as the metric representation, and maybe being able to, I don't know, store it or query it long term as a Prometheus query fashion.
Yeah. So that's actually exactly what recording rules provide. Is you configure. Prometheus, as of the most recent or most two recent versions, lets you actually remote write to it, or you can remote write to, so like Cortex or Thanos or any other. So recording rules will let you configure a Prometheus remote write endpoint and generate, basically synthesize metrics from the logs as they're ingested.
Okay, so the fact that it's in the ruler is just sort of coincidental.
Yeah, annoying coincidence, I guess.
That's fine.
Is it in the ruler, or is it in the?
What you were saying is that it's part of the ruler, which just made me immediately.
Yeah,
I can probably answer this question. I think you're asking, are recording rules evaluated in the ruler?
Yeah.
Well, yes, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The ruler itself is it's a component that was started in Cortex, right? Which is the which Loki derives a lot of like architectural and code from. And it originally did recording rules in addition to alerting rules. When we added alerting rules into Loki, at that time, Prometheus didn't implement the remote write API. So you couldn't write back to Prometheus. And so if we wanted to implement something like recording rules for Loki at that time, we would have had to do something bespoke, like, just for Cortex, for instance. So recently, 4 months ago or something, Prometheus merged the remote write API into itself. So a Prometheus could accept the remote write protocol, which it previously used to send data from a Prometheus to, another Prometheus or something like Cortex. And that basically enabled us to do this in a much more elegant and simple fashion. But like a lot of the plumbing in the code was already there to enable recording rules. And it's something that we've wanted to add for a long time. It just kind of became very feasible recently. But to give you a real example of like kind of how we use this recording rules internally, we have like these external SLAs that we'll run for customers. And then that means we'll have internal SLO, service level objectives. And this will say, okay, basically we need to end up tracking error rates across, maybe not across each pod or each container that we run, but across like an entire cluster. And so we'll use recording rules to basically, every minute or so, evaluate every pod in the cluster and then aggregate them, right? To build these cluster level SLOs. We can then use those to write into a series, which is then already pre-aggregated, right? And already has all of the hard work done effectively. And then we can use those very, very quickly in Prometheus. Does that help kind of get the picture?
Yeah, I think I think just because of the way the ruler was originally presented as being for alerts, that's how when you're saying recording rules, I thought, oh, these are just for alerting, so and not in a general case. Okay.
Yeah. So for what it's worth, recording rules and alerting rules are like very, very similar.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah, no, on the previous
which
I knew, but yeah, I thought this was just sort of a functional thing of Loki in that sense.
Gotcha.
But, no, that's awesome because that then handles. I was using a Prometheus Nginx logs to Prometheus exporter and parsing Nginx logs into Prometheus metrics.
All right.
This would handle that.
There you go.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, though. I think that helps us realize too. We need to make sure we're clear around when we start promoting this. I put a tagline in there, you know, ruler, not just for alerts anymore. Damn, writing the blog post already as we speak. That's all we got on the agenda. Does anybody have anything else that we'll chat about? Got a few minutes.
No, I was really interested in talking about defaults. This is something I think about a lot too, right? Like a lot of times when we set defaults, it's, especially for new features, it's based on our initial understanding, right? And so we'll say, oh, you know, from our initial understanding of this new feature set, it seems like it should have these defaults. But then we run it for, you know, a long period of time, and we develop more and more operational expertise around running it. And then that, you know, kind of feeds back into us actually changing these. And so as Ed was mentioning, we run like our internal clusters with kind of like an overrides, right? Kind of set of defaults, which are basically just accumulated from the knowledge of running Loki for a long time. And we kind of feel like our hands are bound in some ways because it's hard to change these defaults in Loki itself, because that is technically a breaking change. But at the same time, it is also like that they tend to be better ways to run Loki. And it's a hard balance to achieve and to figure out, you know, which side should we err on. And so anyone from the community, right? Like how would you feel? Would you like us to include what we consider to be more sensible defaults at the risk of some things, you know, mutating between releases a little bit?
Yes. So Grafana, I just upgraded some stuff to Grafana 8, and a number of my plugins didn't load. And it's because in Grafana 8, the default now does not allow unsigned plugins, and you have to explicitly allow them. And so, you know, like, I don't know, I have mixed feelings here, right? As the maintainer of a project, I love breaking defaults, but as a user of a project, I hate it when people break defaults.
Yeah. What we're looking for is people to give us, you know, license to do it and not feel bad.
Just, you know, silence is acceptance here too. If nobody says no, we're going to start crushing defaults all over the place. No, that's a joke.
Are you considering defaults? Could you break it into categories? Defaults having to do with timing, like, you know, if it's 5 minutes as opposed to you find 10 minutes. Do you really consider that a breaking change? I mean, as opposed to enabling, disabling, whatever, some feature.
Yeah. Well, here's a good example, or I have a couple good examples. I did with 2.0 change these, and when we did BoltDB shipper, but, you know, years ago, Loki never had a config called chunk target size. And we added that, and for the longest time, like, it never existed in the default configs because it's kind of an operational behavior. It changes the memory consumption, changes a few things. It's kind of crept in over time, but like, there's not a cluster that we run that doesn't set that config now. And I suspect there are people out there that maybe don't, because they, you know, I mean, now we have new configs for that, right? Like, but similarly, we use Snappy as the compressor for all of our clusters. The default is gzip. Gzip is slower. It's more compression effective, so it creates smaller compressed objects, so it's cheaper to operate Loki in the storage perspective. But, you know, for most people, especially us, storage is not the expensive component of running Loki, and getting query speed and performance is more important to us, so we use Snappy. What's the right default there, you know? And do we ever risk changing it because it, you know, I mean, the good news is, like, you can change it whenever you want, and whenever you're running, it's just going to create chunks with that format, and you can always read gzip or Snappy. So, like, you know, you can change it at will, but, like, it's, you know, it's tricky. The schema upgrade we did from V9 to V11 was another example of, like, one, but that one has a different problem of it being harder to roll out. But to answer your question, though, Kara, there definitely is a difference here between some of these things, right? Like changing a timeout, which has almost no impact, seems fine, or likely wouldn't, but something that might change the memory overhead of your running setup, or change like, your CPU versus storage costs, like those I'm not really sure. There's enough different use cases with Loki that I'm not sure which one we want to optimize for. Like, I would say in my mind, it's I don't know, let's say 1 to 10 terabyte a day cluster size, right? Like that probably covers, 50. I'm making up numbers now. I have no idea what percentage of users that covers. Like, if you're in the hundreds of gigs a day, like, I don't know that this stuff adds up to make a huge difference to you. If you're over 10 terabytes a day, like, give us a call, because we were curious to see how things are working for you. In that 1 to 10 terabyte a day, I feel like is where we tend to size a lot of our operating instances, which is where a lot of our configs are tuned.
I think maybe two things is that if you've got a configuration set and you're accepting the default, it seems like you're opening that door regardless that the default value may change, right? You're kind of accepting whatever the software is providing for you. So, and since most of Loki, in order to run it, tempo is the same way, is that you have to override the defaults. If there's anything that you're accepting the default on, I don't know. I feel like if you're not already overriding it by explicitly setting it to, yep, I want gzip, then you're sort of YOLOing it, right? Like,
yeah.
So I'd feel comfortable saying, like, hey, here's an announcement to the community that in this version something's going to change, and I'd be okay with that. Like, all right, well, I'll go change my config so that we set that now. I don't want to use that, but as long as there's some lead time to it. Yeah, and if you're pulling from main and running that, you've got a different set of issues going on there too, right? And then I think the second part that might help with some of that anyway is on the subject just defaults, is even if you're like, I don't know, like this works for us, but maybe we don't want to make that the default, is like having going back to Karen with the documentation of things that would help, or you said examples, is like, hey, here's kind of some settings that, are you running like a small cluster where, these are your inputs and this is your query rate. Here's some good target settings to start with. And then here's what a medium size is. And then, here's what Grafana runs, right? Would be awesome. A small, medium, large kind of thing where you can figure out like, oh, okay, my ingest rate fits with this, but my query rate's here. So I'll kind of piecemeal these together, and now I have a good starting point above and beyond just the out of the box it turns on setting.
Yeah, actually, I mean, to be honest, there's not a lot that we tune, so it's not a huge number. Like, this is actually, because I don't even know what the implication is, but we talked about like a gRPC. The default gRPC message size limit is 16 megabytes, I think. And I think we run our clusters at 100 megabyte or something like that. And we could make that the default. And I have no idea if that has an implication to anyone. I don't think it would. And it would just help people not run into that problem, because you can hit those limits. Ideally, I would like for there to be the least amount of config possible to use Loki, right? Like the most sort of just, especially for that single binary case, like here's a config file with the fewest number of lines you need to actually run this thing. And then people can discover them as they need to do things that are outside of the entry level case. I think that's sounds reasonable, I guess, but all right. I think anybody have anything else we want to? Minutes left, but
yeah, going once.
Thanks for showing up today, everyone. I love seeing. Yeah, I love the donut dog. Poor donut dog.
It's a good doggo.
Tell your friends, tell your enemies, come check out the Loki community call. We were talking about this, like, we've we're starting to get more interest. It's getting more exciting. We're going to start doing a better job of promoting and coming up with an agenda more than a few minutes ahead of time, and see if there's more things that we can do to like engage in discussion, because that's actually super fun for us. So appreciate, Zach, your input on this has been real fun. And the couple folks that we've seen, Roger, I know you've been here a few times. Love it. Thanks to everybody else for coming, asking questions, and we see you all in a month. Hopefully we'll have another Loki release to talk about.
Take care, everyone.